Maria Santos woke up at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just like she had done every day for the past 3 years. The small alarm clock beside her bed made its familiar buzzing sound that she had grown to hate, but could not live without. She reached over and turned it off before it could wake up her elderly neighbor, who lived in the apartment next door. The thin walls of the building meant that every sound traveled easily from room to room. She sat up slowly and rubbed her eyes. Outside her small window, she could see the first hints of sunrise painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. The view from her apartment was not beautiful, but it was familiar. She could see the main street that led to the marketplace, and beyond that, the hills where the military compound sat like a concrete fortress against the landscape. Maria had learned to find comfort in routine during these difficult years of living in a war-torn region. Every morning she would make herself a cup of weak coffee using the small electric kettle that sat on the wooden table in her kitchen. The coffee was never very good because real coffee was expensive and hard to find, but it was warm and it helped her wake up properly. While the water heated up, she would wash her face with cold water from the small basin near her bed. There was running water in the building, but it only worked for a few hours each day and never in the early morning. She had learned to fill up several containers with water during the evening so she would have enough for the next day. After washing her face, she would get dressed in the same type of clothes she wore every day. A simple blue dress that came down to her knees and a light jacket that she could take off if the day became too warm. The clothes were practical and comfortable, and they did not draw attention to her when she walked through the streets. The most important part of her morning routine was preparing her leather satchel. This old brown bag had belonged to her father, who had been a teacher before the conflicts began. Inside the satchel, she would carefully place all the documents that needed to be translated that day. These papers were her lifeline to earning money and staying useful to the international peacekeeping forces. Maria worked as a translator, which meant she helped people who spoke different languages understand each other. The peacekeeping soldiers came from many different countries, and they needed someone who could speak both their languages and the local language that people in her region used. She was good at this job because she had always been interested in learning new words and phrases. Her language skills had developed over many years. As a child, she had learned the local dialect from her grandmother, who told wonderful stories in the old style. In school, she had studied English and French from teachers who had traveled to other countries. When the international forces arrived, she had practiced with soldiers and aid workers until she could speak clearly and accurately. The work was not always easy or safe. Sometimes she had to translate during meetings where people were angry or scared. Other times she had to help families understand complicated legal documents or medical information. But Maria felt proud that she could help people communicate when they desperately needed to understand each other. She had been doing this job for 3 years now, ever since the peacekeeping forces set up their base in the compound outside town. Before that, she had worked in a small office helping local businesses with their paperwork, but that job disappeared when the fighting got worse and many businesses had to close down. The peacekeeping work paid better than anything else available in the region, and it gave her a sense of purpose. She knew that her translations could sometimes make the difference between peace and conflict between people who were already frightened and suspicious of each other. On this particular Tuesday morning, Maria felt the same mixture of nervousness and determination that she experienced every day. She never knew what kind of situations she might encounter at work. Some days were quiet with simple document translations. Other days brought emergency meetings where tensions ran high, and every word had to be chosen very carefully. She finished packing her satchel and checked to make sure she had everything she needed. Her identification papers that allowed her to enter the military compound, her notebook where she wrote down unfamiliar words and phrases to look up later, her small dictionary that helped when she encountered technical terms she had never seen before. The walk to work took about 20 minutes if she went straight through the main street and the marketplace. Maria had tried different routes over the years, but this path was the safest and most reliable. She knew all the shopkeepers along the way, and they knew her, which gave her a sense of security. In a place where strangers were often viewed with suspicion. As she locked her apartment door, she noticed that the hallway seemed quieter than usual. Normally she could hear her neighbors moving around and getting ready for their own days, but this morning, everything felt strangely still. She paused for a moment, listening, but heard nothing unusual, so she started down the stairs. The Building where she lived had been constructed many years ago, and the stairs creaked under her feet as she walked down to the main entrance. She always counted the steps without thinking about it. 14 steps from her floor to the ground level. It was one of those small habits that helped her feel in control of her environment. When she stepped outside, the morning air felt fresh and cool against her skin. The sun was higher now, and the streets were beginning to show signs of life. A few early vendors were setting up their stalls in preparation for the busy morning market period. Children were walking to school carrying books and lunch containers. Maria began walking toward the marketplace, feeling calm and ready for another day of work. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be the last normal day of her life. She had no idea that within the next few hours everything she thought she knew about her peaceful routine would be destroyed forever. The leather satchel bounced gently against her hip as she walked, and the familiar weight of it gave her confidence. She was good at her job, and people depended on her skills. That sense of purpose carried her forward along the dusty street toward a day that would change everything. The marketplace was already alive with activity when Maria arrived at her usual time. She could smell the fresh bread baking in the small ovens that the vendors used and hear the familiar sounds of people calling out prices for their goods. Children ran between the stalls playing games while their mothers bargained with sellers over vegetables and fruits. Maria smiled as she approached the bread stall where Hassan, the baker, was arranging his morning batch of loaves. Hassan was an old man with kind eyes and rough hands that showed years of hard work. He had been running this stall for more than 20 years, and he knew every regular customer by name. Hassan looked up and saw Maria coming toward his stall. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as he reached under his counter and pulled out a loaf of bread that was still warm from the oven. This was their daily routine. Hassan always saved the best and freshest bread for Maria because she was one of his most loyal customers. "Good morning, Maria," he said in the local dialect. "I have your usual bread ready, and it is still warm from baking. The crust is perfect today, not too hard and not too soft, just the way you like it." Maria reached into her small purse to get money for the bread. She enjoyed these brief conversations with Hassan because they reminded her of simpler times, before the conflicts began, when people could focus on normal things like fresh bread and friendly greetings. As she counted out the coins she needed, something caught her attention from the corner of her eye. There were men standing around the marketplace who did not look like regular customers or vendors. They were trying to blend in with the crowd, but something about their posture and the way they watched people made them stand out. These men were positioned at different points around the square, almost like they were forming a circle around the entire marketplace. They wore ordinary clothes like everyone else, but their clothes looked newer and cleaner than what most local people could afford. Their shoes were also different, heavy boots that looked more like military footwear than the simple sandals that most people wore. Maria felt a strange chill run down her spine, even though the morning was warm. Her translator work had taught her to notice small details and read situations quickly. These men were not here to buy vegetables or chat with neighbors. They had a purpose, and that purpose felt dangerous. She looked more carefully at one of the men who was standing near the fruit vendor. He was pretending to examine some apples, but his eyes kept moving around the crowd, studying faces and locations. His hand rested near his waist in a way that suggested he might be carrying something hidden under his jacket. Hassan noticed that Maria had stopped counting her money and was looking around the marketplace with a worried expression. He followed her gaze and saw what she was seeing. His own face became serious, and he leaned forward to speak to her in a quiet voice. "Maria," he whispered, "those men have been here since before sunrise. They are not from this area, and they are not here to shop. I think something bad is going to happen today. Maybe you should not stay here very long." Before Maria could respond to Hassan, the atmosphere in the marketplace suddenly changed. The normal sounds of conversation and bargaining became quieter as other people began to notice the strange men. Children stopped playing their games and moved closer to their parents. Vendors started looking around nervously. Then everything exploded into chaos without any warning. The attack began from multiple directions at once. The men who had been pretending to shop suddenly produced weapons from under their clothes and started shouting commands. The peaceful marketplace transformed into a scene of terror as people screamed and tried to run in all directions at the same time. Maria dropped her coins, and they scattered across the ground, making tiny ringing sounds that were immediately drowned out by the noise of panic and violence. She could not understand what was happening or why these men had chosen to attack innocent people who were just trying to buy food and supplies for their families. The attackers moved with frightening efficiency. They were not acting like angry or emotional people. Instead, they seemed calm and organized, like they had practiced these actions many times before. Some of them blocked the main exits from the square while others began grabbing specific people from the crowd. Maria watched in horror as two of the attackers approached. Hassan, who was standing frozen behind his bread counter. The old baker raised his hands to show that he was not a threat, but the men grabbed him anyway and started dragging him away from his stall. His fresh loaves of bread fell to the ground and were trampled by people running for safety. In that moment of watching Hassan being taken away, Maria felt a rage and helplessness that she had never experienced before. This kind, gentle man who had shown her friendship every morning was being treated like a criminal for no reason that she could understand. She started to move toward Hassan to try to help him. But before she could take more than 2 steps, something struck her from behind with tremendous force. The kick hit her in the side of her head, and the impact was so powerful that it lifted her off her feet and sent her flying through the air. Maria crashed into the hard concrete surface of the marketplace and felt pain explode through her skull like lightning. Her vision became blurry and filled with bright flashing spots that made it impossible to see clearly. The sounds around her became distant and distorted, as if she was hearing them from underwater. Blood began to trickle down the side of her face from where the kick had connected. She could taste something metallic in her mouth and realized that she had bitten her tongue when she hit the ground. Every part of her head throbbed with a pain that was worse than anything she had ever felt before. Through the confusion and agony, Maria forced herself to stay conscious, even though part of her wanted to slip into darkness where the pain might stop. She could hear heavy boots walking around her, and voices speaking in languages that she recognized but could not quite focus on understanding. She kept her eyes closed and tried to breathe as quietly as possible. Every instinct told her that moving or making any sound might bring more violence down on her. The smart thing to do was to pretend to be unconscious and hope that the attackers would leave her alone. As she lay motionless on the cold concrete, Maria began to realize that she had accidentally become a witness to something much more serious than a simple robbery or random attack. The organization and planning that she had observed suggested that this was part of something bigger and more dangerous than anyone in the marketplace had imagined. 3 days had passed since the terrible attack at the marketplace, and Maria was still alive, but barely. Her head felt like someone was hitting it with a hammer every time she tried to move. The pain was so intense that even opening her eyes made her feel sick to her stomach. She had been hiding in a small basement room that smelled of old medicine and fear. The person taking care of her was a doctor named Ahmed, who ran a secret clinic for people who could not go to the regular hospital. Dr. Ahmed was a thin man with gray hair and gentle hands that moved carefully when he cleaned the dried blood from Maria's wounds. He spoke in whispers because even in this hidden place they had to be careful about making noise. Dr. Ahmed had found Maria 3 days ago when he was walking through the marketplace, looking for injured people who might need help. She had been lying unconscious behind a pile of broken wooden crates where someone had dragged her body. At first he thought she was dead because there was so much blood on her face and she was not moving at all. But when he checked for a pulse, he felt her heart still beating weakly under his fingers. He knew that moving her was dangerous because of her head injury, but leaving her in the marketplace was even more dangerous. The attackers might come back to make sure there were no witnesses left alive. So Dr. Ahmed had carried Maria to his secret clinic, which was located in the basement of an old apartment building. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall that looked like part of the regular basement storage area. Inside there were medical supplies that he had collected over many months and simple beds where he could treat people who had nowhere else to go. During the first 2 days, Maria drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she would wake up and try to speak, but the words came out confused and mixed up. Dr. Ahmed gave her water and small amounts of food when she was awake enough to swallow. He also gave her medicine for the pain, but he did not have very much and had to use it carefully. On the 3rd day, Maria woke up and her mind felt clearer than it had since the attack. She could remember what had happened in the marketplace, and she could speak in complete sentences again. The first thing she asked Dr. Ahmed was whether Hassan the baker was safe and alive. Dr. Ahmed looked sad when she asked this question. He sat down on a small chair beside her bed and spoke in a quiet voice that was full of sorrow. Hassan had not been seen since the day of the attack. Several other people from the marketplace had also disappeared and no one knew where. They had been taken or if they were still alive. But Dr. Ahmed had more disturbing news to share with Maria. The attack on their marketplace was not the only one that had happened recently. Similar attacks had taken place in 5 other locations around the region during the same week. In each case, the pattern was exactly the same. Men in civilian clothes had surrounded a busy public area like a market or school. They had acted with military precision and organization. They had taken specific people away while leaving others behind. And in every case, the local news reports had described the incidents as spontaneous. Violence between different ethnic groups who hated each other. Dr. Ahmed explained that he had been treating victims from all of these attacks over the past week. The injuries were similar and the stories were similar. But most importantly, the survivors all described seeing the same type of coordinated planning and professional equipment that Maria had witnessed. This information made Maria feel even more afraid than she had been before. The kick to her head had been terrible, but learning about the bigger pattern made her realize that she had accidentally seen something that powerful people wanted to keep secret. Her survival and her memory of what happened could be dangerous to whoever was organizing these attacks. Dr. Ahmed introduced Maria to 3 other people who were also staying in the hidden clinic. There was Fatima, a young teacher whose school had been attacked 2 days after the marketplace incident. There was Omar, a journalist who had been investigating strange reports from around the region. And there was Layla, an aid worker, who had noticed unusual activity at several refugee camps. These 4 people had all witnessed or investigated parts of the same larger pattern of organized violence. When they shared their stories and information with each other, the picture became much clearer and much more frightening. Someone with significant resources and military training was conducting a campaign of terror across the entire region. The attacks were not random ethnic violence as the news reports claimed. They were carefully planned operations designed to eliminate specific people who might have important information or who might be able to organize resistance. The attackers used expensive military equipment and followed detailed plans that required months of preparation. Omar, the journalist, had been trying to investigate these connections before his own newspaper office was burned down. He had discovered that all of the attacked areas had one thing in common. They were places where local people had been asking questions about missing international aid money or about suspicious military activities in their neighborhoods. Fatima, the teacher, had noticed that several of her students had parents who worked for international organizations or government offices. These families had been specifically targeted during the attack on her school. The attackers had known exactly which people they wanted to find and take away. Layla, the aid worker, had seen unusual movement of military vehicles and equipment in areas that were supposed to be peaceful zones. She had also noticed that certain refugee camps were being managed by private security companies instead of regular international aid organizations. As these 4 people shared their information, they began to understand that they were not just random victims of violence. They were witnesses to evidence of a massive conspiracy that reached much higher than local ethnic conflicts. Someone was using the chaos and confusion of regional tensions to cover up systematic crimes and eliminate anyone who might expose the truth. Dr. Ahmed listened to all of their stories and realized that his secret clinic had become more than just a place to treat injuries. It had become the meeting point for a group of people who might be the only ones capable of revealing the truth about what was really happening in their region. But they also knew that their knowledge made them extremely dangerous to the people behind these attacks. Every day they stayed alive was another day that the conspiracy remained at risk of being exposed, and the attackers had already shown that they were willing to use extreme violence to protect their secrets. 2 weeks had passed since Maria first met the other survivors in Dr. Ahmed's hidden clinic. Her head injury was healing slowly, but her determination to find the truth had grown stronger every day. The small group of witnesses had decided to work together to collect real evidence about the organized attacks that were being blamed on ethnic violence. Maria used her translator skills to help the group communicate with survivors who spoke different languages and dialects. Many of the victims were too scared to talk to official investigators, but they trusted Maria because she was one of them. She had been hurt in the same way, and she understood their fear and anger. Every morning, Maria would carefully wrap a scarf around her head to hide the healing wound from her injury. Then she would walk to different neighborhoods to meet with families who had lost relatives during the attacks. These conversations were dangerous, because the attackers might be watching for people who were asking too many questions. The stories she heard were heartbreaking, but they all followed the same terrible pattern. In every case, the attackers had known exactly who they were looking for. They had lists of names and they had detailed information about where specific people lived and worked. This was not random violence between neighbors who suddenly decided to hate each other. Omar, the journalist, had contacts throughout the region who could provide information about unusual activities they had observed. Before his newspaper office was destroyed, he had been building a network of sources who trusted him to tell their stories honestly. These people continued to share information, even though it was now much more dangerous to do so. One of Omar's sources was a man who worked at the main telephone exchange for the region. This man had noticed strange patterns in communication traffic during the weeks before each attack. There had been increased radio transmissions between unknown locations and unusual coordination between different military units that were supposed to be working independently. Another source was a woman who managed supplies for several international aid organizations. She had noticed that certain types of equipment were being ordered and delivered to locations that did not match the official aid distribution plans. Medical supplies were being sent to areas with no hospitals. Food supplies were being delivered to empty buildings. Fatima, the teacher, had started secretly meeting with other teachers and school administrators from around the region. Many schools had been attacked or threatened, and the teachers were beginning to share information about what they had seen before and during these incidents. The teachers had noticed that strangers had been asking questions about their students and their families several weeks before the attacks began. These strangers claimed to be conducting surveys for international organizations, but they were asking very specific questions about which parents worked for government offices or aid agencies. Fatima also discovered that several schools had received new security equipment shortly before they were attacked. The equipment was supposed to protect the schools, but it seemed designed more for surveillance than protection. Cameras were pointed at areas where they could record faces rather than at entrances, where they would prevent break-ins. Layla, the aid worker, had the most access to official information because her job required her to coordinate with multiple international organizations. She began carefully collecting documents and reports that showed discrepancies between what was supposed to happen and what actually happened during aid operations. She found evidence that large amounts of money were being moved through accounts that did not match any legitimate aid programs. Vehicles and equipment were being registered to organizations that either did not exist or had been created very recently with no clear purpose or history. Most importantly, Layla discovered that private security companies were being hired to manage refugee camps and aid distribution centers without proper oversight from international authorities. These companies had military training and equipment, but they were not subject to the same rules and monitoring that applied to official peacekeeping forces. Dr. Ahmed provided medical evidence that supported what the others were discovering through their investigations. He had been treating victims from all of the attacks, and he could document that the injuries were consistent with professional military weapons and tactics rather than improvised violence between civilians. The weapons used in the attacks were high-quality military equipment that was not available to ordinary people in the region. The attackers had used coordination and communication systems that required extensive training and planning. Most importantly, the medical evidence showed that the attackers had been selective about who they injured and who they killed. As the group collected more evidence, they began to understand the full scope of what they were uncovering. The attacks were part of a larger operation designed to destabilize the region and create justification for increased military intervention by international forces and private security companies. The people being targeted were not chosen because of their ethnic background or religious beliefs. They were chosen because they had access to information about corruption in aid programs or because they had been asking questions about suspicious military activities in their communities. Maria realized that her translator work with the peacekeeping forces had given her access to information that made her a target. She had been translating documents and conversations that revealed discrepancies between official reports and actual conditions on the ground. Her language skills allowed her to understand communications that were supposed to remain secret. The group decided that they needed to organize all of their evidence into a comprehensive report that could be shared with international media and human rights organizations. But they also knew that compiling such a report would make them even more dangerous to the people behind the conspiracy. They began working in shifts to document everything they had discovered. Maria would spend her days interviewing survivors and translating their statements into multiple languages. Omar would write up the findings in a format that journalists and investigators could understand and verify. Fatima would organize the evidence by location and date to show the patterns clearly. Layla would provide the financial and organizational documentation that proved the official explanations were false. Dr. Ahmed continued to treat new victims while also documenting the medical evidence that supported their conclusions. His clinic became not just a place for healing, but also a repository for proof of systematic crimes against innocent people. But as they worked, the group began to notice signs that they were being watched. Cars with tinted windows appeared near the buildings where they were meeting. Strange clicks and interruptions occurred during their phone conversations. People who had been willing to share information suddenly became afraid to be seen talking to them. The evidence they were collecting could expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of political and military power. But time was running out, and they knew that their own survival depended on getting this information to people who could act on it before the attackers decided to eliminate them permanently. The morning that changed everything started like any other day in Dr. Ahmed's hidden clinic. Maria was organizing witness statements when Fatima burst through the secret entrance with tears streaming down her face and panic in her eyes. She could barely speak through her sobbing, but the message she brought was clear and terrifying. Dr. Ahmed was gone. Fatima had gone to check on the doctor at his regular clinic above ground where he sometimes treated patients who were not part of their secret investigation. When she arrived, she found the front door hanging open and the inside of the clinic completely destroyed. Medical equipment was smashed on the floor. Cabinets were torn apart, and their contents scattered everywhere. There were signs of a violent struggle. The neighbors told Fatima that they had heard shouting and crashing sounds around midnight, but they were too afraid to look outside their windows. In the morning, they had seen men in dark clothing loading something heavy into the back of a black vehicle. By the time anyone was brave enough to investigate the men, and the vehicle were already gone, Maria felt her heart sink as she listened to Fatima's report. Dr. Ahmed had been like a father to all of them during these dangerous weeks. He had risked his own safety to treat their injuries and provide them with a safe place to work on their investigation. Now he had paid the ultimate price for helping them seek the truth. But worse than the personal loss was what his disappearance meant for their mission. Dr. Ahmed had been the keeper of much of their medical evidence. He had photographs of injuries from all the attacks and detailed reports about the weapons that had been used. His documentation proved that the violence was organized and professional, rather than spontaneous and emotional. Omar arrived at the clinic an hour after Fatima with equally devastating news. His main source at the telephone exchange had been found dead in his apartment that morning. The official report claimed it was a heart attack, but Omar knew better. The man had been young and healthy with no history of heart problems. More importantly, he had called Omar just 2 days earlier to report unusual communication patterns that suggested another attack was being planned. The pattern was becoming clear and frightening. The people behind the conspiracy were systematically eliminating anyone who had helped with the investigation. They were not just trying to stop future evidence collection. They were trying to destroy the evidence that had already been gathered and silence the witnesses who could testify about what they had discovered. Layla had not returned to the clinic at her usual time, and Maria began to worry that something had happened to her as well. They had no way to contact her safely because using phones or radios would reveal their location to whoever was hunting them. All they could do was wait and hope that she was being careful and staying hidden. As the hours passed, Maria realized that their small group of investigators had become the targets of a manhunt. The attackers were no longer content to simply carry out their planned operations while avoiding detection. They were actively pursuing anyone who posed a threat to their conspiracy. The evidence that the group had collected was hidden in multiple locations around the city, but Maria knew that even those hiding places might not be safe. If the attackers had been watching them for weeks, They might know about all of their meeting spots and storage areas. The documentation that had taken so much courage and effort to gather could be destroyed at any moment. Maria made a decision that she knew would be extremely dangerous, but seemed to be their only chance of survival. She had to find a way to get their evidence to someone in the international peacekeeping forces who had the authority and integrity to act on it, but she could not trust the local officials who might be part of the conspiracy. She remembered Colonel Morrison, who supervised the international translator program where she had worked before the marketplace attack. Morrison was from a different country than most of the peacekeeping leadership, and he had always seemed genuinely concerned about protecting civilians. More importantly, he had the security clearance and communication access needed to contact higher authorities outside the region. But reaching Morrison would require Maria to leave the safety of the hidden clinic and risk being captured or killed by the people who were hunting her. She would have to cross the city to reach the peacekeeping compound while avoiding the surveillance network that had already claimed. Dr. Ahmed and Omar's source Fatima and Omar argued that the risk was too great and that Maria should wait for Layla to return before making such a dangerous move. But Maria knew that waiting might mean losing their last chance to get the evidence to someone who could act on it. Every hour that passed gave the attackers more time to eliminate witnesses and destroy documentation. She spent the afternoon preparing copies of the most important evidence in a format that could be quickly understood and verified. She organized witness statements by location and date. She compiled photographs and medical reports that proved the attacks were coordinated. She wrote summaries of the financial irregularities and organizational connections that Layla had discovered. As evening approached, Maria put all of this documentation into a waterproof bag that she could carry hidden under her clothing. She knew that if she was caught with these materials, it would mean certain death. But she also knew that without this evidence, the attackers would continue their campaign of terror, and more innocent people would disappear or die. Before leaving the clinic, Maria wrote letters to each of her companions explaining her decision and asking them to continue the investigation if she did not return. She also wrote a letter to her family explaining what had happened to her and why she had chosen to risk everything for the truth. Omar tried one more time to convince her to wait, but Maria's mind was made up. She had seen Hassan dragged away from his bread stall. She had felt the crushing blow to her head that was meant to silence her forever. She had watched Dr. Ahmed disappear into the night because he had tried to help seek justice for the victims. As darkness fell over the city, Maria wrapped her scarf around her head to hide her healing injuries and stepped out into the dangerous streets. She carried with her not just evidence of a conspiracy, but the hopes of everyone who had been hurt by the organized violence that was tearing their region apart. The journey to reach Colonel Morrison would take her through areas where the attackers might be waiting. But it was a risk she had to take because staying hidden would only delay the inevitable. The hunt for the truth seekers had begun, and their only chance of survival was to make sure the evidence reached people who could use it to stop the conspiracy. Maria moved through the dark streets like a ghost, trying to avoid detection by the people who wanted her dead. Every shadow could hide an enemy, and every sound could be the footsteps of someone following her. The bag of evidence felt heavy against her chest where she had hidden it under her jacket, but she knew it contained the only proof that could stop the conspiracy. The peacekeeping compound was located on the other side of the city, which meant Maria had to cross several dangerous neighborhoods where the attackers might be waiting for her. She stayed away from the main roads and used narrow alleys and side streets that she had learned during her years of walking to work every day. 3 times during her journey, she had to hide behind buildings or in doorways when she heard vehicles approaching. Each time her heart pounded so loudly that she was afraid the sound would give away her location. The vehicles moved slowly through the streets with their headlights sweeping back and forth as if they were searching for something or someone. After 2 hours of careful movement, Maria finally reached the outer fence of the peacekeeping compound. The guards at the main gate recognized her even though she had not been to work since the marketplace attack. They knew her as a reliable translator who had never caused any problems during her 3 years of service. But when Maria asked to see Colonel Morrison immediately, the guards seemed confused and concerned. One of them made a phone call and then told Maria that Colonel Morrison was no longer at the compound. He had been transferred to another assignment in a different region just 2 days earlier. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Maria felt her hope beginning to crumble, but she refused to give up when she had come so far and risked so much. She asked to speak with whoever had replaced Morrison as the head of translator services. The guards made another phone call, and after several minutes they told her that she could meet with Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, who was Morrison's temporary replacement. Lieutenant. Colonel Barnes was a tall woman with serious eyes and short gray hair. She met Maria in a small office that smelled of coffee and paper. Maria could tell immediately that Barnes was different from Morrison. She seemed more suspicious and less willing to listen to concerns from local staff members when Maria began to explain what had happened at the marketplace and what she had discovered about the organized attacks. Barnes interrupted her several times with questions that seemed designed to challenge her credibility rather than understand her information. Barnes asked why Maria had not reported these concerns through official channels and why she had waited so long to bring them to the attention of peacekeeping leadership. Maria realized that Barnes either did not believe her story or did not want to believe it. But she had not come this far to be dismissed by someone who was unwilling to look at the evidence. She pulled out some of the documents from her hidden bag and placed them on Barnes' desk. The documents included photographs of injuries that Dr. Ahmed had, documented witness statements that Maria had collected, and copies of financial records that Layla had discovered. Maria watched Barnes' face carefully as she examined the evidence and saw something that made her blood run cold. Barnes was not surprised by what she was seeing. She looked at the documents like someone who already knew what they contained. When she looked up at Maria, her expression had changed from suspicion to something that looked more like calculation or concern about how to handle a problem. Barnes told Maria that these were very serious allegations that would require extensive investigation and verification. She said that Maria should leave the documents with her so that they could be properly examined by the appropriate authorities. She also suggested that Maria should stay at the compound for her own safety while the investigation was conducted. But Maria had learned to read people carefully during her years as a translator, and she could tell that Barnes had no intention of investigating anything. The suggestion that Maria should stay at the compound sounded more like an offer to detain her than to protect her. She realized that she had walked into a trap. Maria told Barnes that she needed to use the bathroom and would return in a few minutes to continue their discussion. Barnes seemed satisfied with this explanation and told Maria that she would begin making the necessary phone calls to start the investigation process. As soon as Maria left Barnes' office, she knew that she had to escape from the compound immediately. Whatever network of conspiracy existed, it reached high enough into the peacekeeping command structure that even Morrison's replacement could not be trusted. Her evidence was now in the hands of someone who would probably destroy it rather than act on it. Maria made her way quickly toward the main gate, but before she could reach it, she heard Barnes' voice over the compound announcement system. Barnes was calling for security to detain Maria Santos for questioning in connection with security concerns. The guards at the gate would be waiting for her, and she would not be able to leave through the main entrance. She remembered that there was a maintenance area near the back fence where repair vehicles entered and left the compound. If she could reach that area without being seen, she might be able to climb over the fence or hide in one of the vehicles that was leaving the base. Maria moved carefully through the compound, staying in shadows and avoiding the areas where security patrols would be looking for her. She could hear radio communications between guards who were searching different sections of the base. Her description was being broadcast, and orders were given to detain her immediately if she was found. When she reached the maintenance area, Maria saw a supply truck that was preparing to leave the compound. The driver was completing paperwork with a guard while the truck engine ran. Maria knew that this might be her only chance to escape before more security arrived. She waited until both the driver and guard were distracted by their paperwork, then quickly climbed into the back of the truck and hid behind boxes of supplies. A few minutes later, she felt the truck begin to move toward the gate. Her heart pounded as she heard the guards checking the vehicle, but they did not search the cargo area thoroughly. When the truck reached the main road and Maria was sure they were away from the compound, she jumped out and disappeared into the night. She had lost her evidence, but she was still alive and free. More importantly, she now knew that the Conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the international peacekeeping forces that were supposed to be protecting her people. Her only hope now was that somewhere in the chain of command there were people with enough integrity and authority to stop what was happening. But she would have to find them before the manhunt that had already claimed Dr. Ahmed and others finally caught up with her. 2 days after Maria escaped from the peacekeeping compound, she was hiding in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city when she heard the sound that would change everything. The deep rumbling noise of helicopter rotors filled the air and grew louder as the aircraft approached her location. Her first thought was that Barnes had found her and sent soldiers to capture or kill her. Maria pressed herself against the wall and looked carefully through a broken window to see what was happening outside. The helicopter was large and military, but it did not have the markings of the local peacekeeping forces. Instead, it carried symbols that she recognized from her translator work as belonging to international military justice organizations. The aircraft circled the area several times before, landing in the same marketplace where Maria had been attacked weeks earlier. She watched as armed guards secured the area, and then 3 figures in military uniforms stepped out of the helicopter. Even from a distance, Maria could tell that these were not ordinary soldiers or local commanders. Their bearing and the way others responded to them indicated very high rank and authority. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that important international officials had arrived to investigate the recent violence. Maria learned from people on the street that the 3 passengers were generals from different countries who specialized in war crimes investigations. They had come with their own security teams, communication equipment, and legal authority that could not be challenged by local officials. For the first time since the nightmare began, Maria felt a spark of hope. These might be the honest authorities that she had been trying to reach, but she also knew that approaching them would be extremely dangerous. If the conspiracy reached as high as she suspected, then even these generals might not be safe from corruption, or they might not believe her story without proof. Maria spent the entire day watching the generals and their teams as they methodically examined the marketplace and interviewed witnesses. She could see that they were conducting a real investigation rather than the fake inquiry that local authorities had performed. They took photographs, measured distances, and asked detailed questions that showed they understood how to document evidence properly. On the second day of the investigation, Maria noticed that the generals had established a secure command center in a building near the marketplace. They had posted guards and set up communication equipment that would allow them to contact their superiors without interference from local officials. More importantly, they had begun interviewing people who had been ignored or dismissed by earlier investigators. Maria made her decision. She approached one of the guards and identified herself as a translator and witness to the marketplace attack. She said that she had important information about organized violence in the region and requested a private meeting with the senior general. The guard looked at her carefully and then spoke into his radio. 20 minutes later, Maria found herself sitting across from General Patricia Hayes, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. Hayes listened without interruption as Maria told her complete story from the morning of the marketplace attack through her escape from the peacekeeping compound 2 days earlier. When Maria finished speaking, Hayes asked her a question that made her realize that these generals already knew more than she had expected. Hayes wanted to know if Maria had noticed any connection between the attackers and private security companies that operated in the region. This was exactly the type of detail that Layla had discovered in her investigation of financial irregularities. Maria realized that the generals had not come to investigate random ethnic violence. They had come because someone with authority and integrity had already suspected that organized crimes were being committed under the cover of regional conflicts. Her story was providing confirmation of intelligence that they had received from other sources. General Hayes introduced Maria to the other 2 generals who had arrived with her. General Robert Chen specialized in investigating corruption within peacekeeping operations. General Maria Volkov was an expert in documenting war crimes and building legal cases that could be prosecuted in international courts. For the next 6 hours, Maria told her story again and again while the 3 generals recorded everything and asked hundreds of detailed questions. They wanted to know about every person she had met, every document she had seen, and every conversation she had witnessed. They also showed her photographs of people and asked if she recognized any of the attackers or anyone involved in the conspiracy, Maria was amazed to discover that some of the people in the photographs were high-ranking officials in both local, government, and international organizations. The conspiracy was even larger and more complex than she had imagined. But the generals seemed to have been building a case for months, and her testimony was providing crucial evidence that could tie everything together. The investigation expanded rapidly over the following weeks as the three generals brought in additional experts and resources. They had legal authority to access financial records, communication logs, and personnel files that local investigators could never examine. More importantly, they had the political backing to pursue evidence wherever it led, regardless of how powerful the people involved might be. Maria learned that Colonel Morrison had not been transferred randomly. He had been trying to report suspicious activities through official channels when he was suddenly reassigned to prevent him from continuing his investigation. But before leaving, he had managed to send encrypted communications to the three generals describing what he had observed and recommending that Maria be contacted as a key witness. The arrests began 3 weeks after the helicopter landed. Local officials who had covered up evidence were taken into custody, along with commanders who had participated in planning the attacks. Private security company executives were arrested in multiple countries as international law enforcement agencies coordinated their operations, but the most shocking arrests involved people that Maria had never suspected. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was charged with accepting bribes to suppress investigations. Several aid organization administrators were accused of embezzling funds that were used to finance the attacks. Even some peacekeeping personnel were found to have been working with the conspiracy. The trials took place over many months in international courts, where Maria testified as the primary witness. Her translator skills allowed her to provide detailed testimony in multiple languages while helping other witnesses communicate their experiences to judges and lawyers who came from different countries. The evidence showed that the marketplace attack and similar incidents were part of a larger scheme to create instability that would justify lucrative military contracts for private security companies. The victims had been targeted because they possessed information about financial corruption or because they had asked uncomfortable questions about aid distribution and military activities. Hassan the baker was found alive in a detention facility that was supposed to be used for suspected criminals, but had become a place where witnesses were held to prevent them from talking to investigators. Dr. Ahmed was also rescued along with dozens of other people who had been kidnapped to silence them. 6 months after Maria watched 3 generals step off a helicopter in the marketplace, where her nightmare began, she stood in a courtroom and heard guilty verdicts read against 15 people who had been responsible for organizing systematic violence against innocent civilians. The scar on her head had healed, but Maria would always remember the kick that started her journey toward justice. She now worked with international organizations to train local people in documenting evidence and protecting witnesses. Her experience had taught her that even the most powerful conspiracies could be defeated when brave people refused to stay silent and when honest authorities had the courage to pursue the truth.